The following program deals with a series of brutal murders committed over a century ago. The details and images of these crimes may be shocking. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen out there in the audience. Looks like we got a few people on board already, which is a wonderful thing. Ron, how are you tonight?
I'm doing well. I apologize for last week. I was so looking forward to this show. Life got in the way, and I really want to thank the audience as well too for putting up with us and actually changing until 9 o'clock. My work schedule was just getting out of hand a little bit, and I was starting to work overs on Mondays. And this show means so much to me, and dealing with all the public and everything like that. But I will tell you, I watched the show last week that you did, Chris. And you did a very, very good job. It was actually very enjoyable.
You know what? It ended up being a lot of fun. It wasn't planned. I thought I would just come in and check in with people, and people hadn't seen our posts about the delay on social media, and it just turned into a talk back, and it was great fun. A lot of our regulars stopped in, and we got to talk about some fun stuff, and I got to push my project, so it turned out it went pretty well. So hey, it looks like we got Mary Beth back, and Pepper, and a few folks have been popping in already. So that is wonderful. John, nice to see you as well. So I think this is going to be a really interesting show tonight. I do want to give everybody a couple quick forewarnings. One, I'm sure you noticed with our opening there, we are adding a sort of a viewer discretion for this evening's topic, because the subject of some very brutal, very disturbing murders, and we are going to have some imagery that may be a little bit intense. Secondly, to let you know that we have a lot of content to do for this, and instead of trying to rush through it, what we are going to do, if necessary, is go over tonight. And this could end up being a 90-minute show. I hope you all stick around with us. If you can't stick around, of course, you'll be able to watch the playback later, but just want to let you all know about that, because this is a dense topic and we've got a lot to talk about.
Yeah, and I'm glad that we're doing it tonight because here in Western Pennsylvania, it's very foggy. There's no moonlight out at all, very misty. And whenever I was a child, my mother would call this a perfect night for a murder. And one of the reasons why she said this is because I think that it's appropriate. This would be very similar to Victorian London, wouldn't it?
I would say it would be. Yes, absolutely. And another thing about this is that I've said this many times before. Serial killers are not really my thing. I do love legends, but I've always been more fascinated by supernatural legends and mysteries rather than serial killers. But this story, the case of Jack the Ripper, is extraordinary. It has a great deal of mystery behind it. It has mystery. It has conspiracy. It's become such a part of world culture that everyone knows the name of Jack the Ripper and all of the many permutations thereof. And it's a case that defies standard serial killers. First of all, of course, Jack the Ripper is often referred to as the first serial killer, among the first serial killers, but it really does defy convention in a lot of ways. And in a lot of ways, it threw a spotlight on the Victorian era. And in some ways, people have suggested, and this is a dark thing to suggest, but people have suggested that in a way that Jack the Ripper actually did the world a favor by throwing into relief some of the dreadful conditions present in Victorian London at that time, and by extension in other places. And so it's going to be a fascinating show tonight.
Yeah, and he also has become a bit of an anti-hero, hasn't he? Just like, Jason and all these other kind of creatures. People were drawn to him in almost a kind of romantic viewpoint as well. And that's an interesting comment on our society as well.
I think you're 100% right on that. There is a romanticism about it. I mean, the way that Jack the Ripper is often portrayed in terms of his appearance, his dress, and everything, much of which is supposed to be based on on his actual appearance, but it has a mysterious nature to it. I mean, in a way, it's reminiscent of characters like Batman or the Shadow, these cloaked, mysterious characters running through the fog. So while there's nothing heroic about what Jack the Ripper did, it's definitely a subject that has a romantic element to it. And before we kind of get too much into the meat of it, let's do a little
No
quick
pun
intro
intended.
here. So just for those of you who aren't terribly familiar with it, so for 3 months in the autumn of 1888, London was terrorized by a series of brutal murders targeting the women of the impoverished east side of the city. 135 years later, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains a mystery. And that alone is such a huge part of this. The fact that no one to this day knows who Jack the Ripper was. And a lot of theories, there are tremendous theories, and we're going to be discussing some of these extraordinary theories tonight. Each of us, I think, has our own favorite theory, and we're going to be sharing those with you later. But despite the fact that book after book has come out purporting to solve the crime, there's always another solution that comes down the road a few years later, and so it remains one of the greatest mysteries of the modern age.
And it was quite modern. That's the other thing that's so fascinating about this. My great grandmother was born 2 years after the murder ceased. So this was within memory for a lot of people, that you could have known somebody that was involved in this type of period. So we're not talking ancient history here, and we're also talking about things that were recorded. So we can look at photographs and we can read articles about what was going on. So it's not like we have to kind of use theory and conjecture at this point. We're actually using documentation. We're going to see some photos tonight that are quite grisly. So that's another really cool aspect of this case.
It is. I mean, in a way, it's one of the first true police procedurals, and and that does kind of there's a line in a Jack the Ripper movie called From Hell, where the Ripper himself says that people will look back someday and say that I gave birth to the 20th century, and it's actually an interesting thought. It's the idea that it was kind of the birth of the modern age, and that the sort of cynicism and the brutality that has become such a part of our lives every day that wasn't really, at least not publicly at that time. I think that we live in an era of information where we know everything, with the snap of the fingers, which was not the world back then. But this was the first massive media sensation in a lot of ways. So that is a remarkable thing as well. Now, we say that Jack the Ripper stalked London, and while that is true, specifically the Ripper or the person who came to be known as Jack the Ripper stalked an area called Whitechapel. Whitechapel was a desperately impoverished east side of London, and this in many ways is the part of London where hope went to die. This is where the destitute, the hopeless, the sick would go. This is where the workhouses were and the sweatshops, and it was a grim and very, very grisly life. And so it was an area that, well, as I say, again, in many ways, it was where hope went to die. So the idea of murders in Whitechapel was not uncommon, not even a little bit. In fact, murders were a common thing, so much so that often the police gave almost no notice. Corpses, homicides happened every day, and the corpses were often just swept away by the police, and no significant effort made to investigate the cause of death.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about the East End when we were talking about Scrooge and Charles Dickens, because what had happened over that end is, as you said, there was no hope over there. This was a place, this was as close to purgatory as you could possibly get in this world, if not, hell itself. There would be times whenever the police would go out, especially in the wintertime, whenever they would go into the parks and pick up the dead children that froze to death overnight. And not only to think about that, but this is also the neighborhood where the London Royal Hospital was as well, too. And whenever we think about the Elephant Man, John Merrick, he was actually at this hospital at the same time this was going on as well, too. This was a time of brutality. This was a time whenever London was truly divided between the East End and the West End, between the haves and the have-nots. And as we go a little bit more, we'll also talk about the idea of royalty and commoners and how this all comes into play. But there's a lot of different nuances working within this particular case.
There is, and John, you mentioned a moment ago something about a movie called Time After Time, which is a film about Jack the Ripper, and I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later. It's a fascinating film, one that's actually been remade in the last few years as a television series, and it is a very interesting perspective on the sort of psychology of the Ripper. So we'll be talking about that a little bit later. And Pepper, you were saying that also that you had always heard that the killer came from money. That is almost certainly the case, or at least that's a very, very strong possibility. And again, when we get into the suspects a little bit later on, we're going to talk about the origins of the killer and where, in fact, he may have come from. So hold those thoughts. But we're going to start with an event. And in early August, specifically August 7th of 1888, a middle-aged woman by the name of Martha Tabram was found stabbed to death in George Yard in Whitechapel. And to many people, this is considered to be the first Jack the Ripper killing. But there is question about whether or not she was actually killed by the man who would come to be known as Jack the Ripper, or the person who would come to be known as Jack the Ripper. The thing about Martha Tabram's death is that the way she was killed differed significantly from later killings. She was stabbed at least 33 times. This was a remarkably brutal crime. And the savagery of the assault and the location of the murder has connected it to the Jack the Ripper killings. But as I say, we'll point out a little bit in just a few minutes, really, how it differs quite dramatically from the later killings. So it's possible, if this was the first killing by the Ripper, that he hadn't quite found his, sort of MO yet. But there's good reason to suspect that it may not have actually been done by the same person. As I said, killings at that time were certainly a fairly regular occurrence, and homicide was as well.
Yeah, we must think about Jeffrey Dahmer here and how popular that television show was. It takes a while to perfect these kind of madman's desires and the way they're going to go and pursue particular killings. Now, what's so interesting about that initial one, when we talk about canonical and non-canonical, this is something that appears to be outside of the Ripper's MO. But we also have to look at that as well. He does focus upon sexual areas within the body as well too, which I think does stand out. We have the assault on the breast, we have one puncture wound in the womb area. So if we are going down that path and we're saying that we're dealing with somebody that had some sort of affinity towards the women of the evening or women in general, we see at least a nuance, at least a bit of an embryonic spark in this particular killing that may indeed lead to the other killing. So this indeed might be Jack the Ripper just trying things out.
And certainly, again, that is incredibly possible. That's why, for so many people, it is often referred to as the first of the Jack the Ripper killings. But it's an interesting, you mentioned the word canonical, and it is a word that's frequently used in relation to the Ripper murders, because over the course of almost 3 years, quite a number of killings happened throughout Whitechapel that have been linked to or suspected to have possibly been the work of Jack the Ripper. Alice McKenna, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Kelly, Elizabeth Stride, but many others. And of those many killings, and those were only the ones that are considered to be possible Ripper killings, there are actually only 5 which are considered to be canonical. And because, or we use that word canonical specifically because what we're doing is trying to determine which of these killings matched the Ripper's consistent MO. And Martha Tabram, that first killing on August the 7th, was different enough that it has never been conclusively determined that it was the Ripper's killings. But these other five women that we're going to be discussing all match the MO with a great deal of precision, even though there are some significant differences in the crimes. And so for the sake of argument, we're going to go with the idea that it was probably these 5 women are almost certainly victims of the same killer. Martha Tabram, certainly a very reasonable possibility, but not for sure. The others fall a little bit farther outside of both the method of the killings, but also the time frame of the killings, and there's a great deal more doubt. So we're not going to go into them in any detail tonight. We're going to stick with the 5 who are considered to be the canonical victims of the Ripper.
Now, before we jump in, have you been to Whitechapel there, Chris?
I have not, unfortunately. It's definitely on my bucket list for a place to see in one of my future adventures, and I've been considering doing a book on the Ripper. I'm not sure I can add anything new to the narrative, but it's always been on the back burner for me.
Right. So I've got a chance to go there. It's probably been about 20 years ago, and it's very clustered there. It's not a huge area, but it would have even been more confining and constrictive 100 and some years ago, because World War II took a lot of the buildings out, so there's more open spaces there now, but back in the day it probably was just simply tenement upon tenement, a few little open spaces here, sewage running raw in the streets. It would have been a very, very bad place to be.
It would indeed. And of course, you have to remember that while it was lit at night by gaslight, that gaslight is nothing like modern, modern street lamps or the electric light that we have that seems to flood every nook and cranny. And so it would have been a very dark, very dismal place, even with all the gas lamps lit, and a very, very good area for a predator to stalk. And so it was that on the 31st of August, 1888, Mary Ann, known as Polly Nichols, was discovered, and she is considered generally to be the first canonical victim of the Ripper. Now, the Polly Nichols was found in Bucks Row, which, as you can see this illustration here, that it was a narrow back alley and not well lit, an area where the killer could certainly have dragged a victim. However, he did that and and gone about what he referred to, or is believed to have referred to, as his work, and that's something we'll talk about a little bit later. But the condition of Polly Nichols' body was truly dreadful. She had had her throat slit so deeply that it nearly decapitated her, and then further incisions were made, almost entirely focusing on the area of her sexual organs and her womb. But rather than stabbing, as we had mentioned with Martha Tabram, the killer had cut these in slices. These were deliberate, very, very clean slices, and it definitely appeared not to be an act of anger or savage or uncontrolled rage. There appeared to be what you would call a deliberate intention here, and that's something that became very, very important as the investigations of the Ripper case, what again at this time were simply known as the Whitechapel horrors or the Whitechapel murders, began to unfold.
Right. And this is probably, the very initial murder, whenever there's the idea that these bodies might have been taken someplace, actually worked upon, and then the bodies just thrown back out onto the streets. That was a very early thing as well, too. And people started to think, well, is this person in a coach? Is it possible he's picking up these women, taking them someplace, doing the deed, and then just dropping the bodies back as some sort of evidence? These are all very curious things because it gets into the mind of the person and also gets into a social class as well.
Absolutely. Now, the murder, when it first occurred, again, was not considered to be particularly noteworthy. Martha Tabram and Polly Nichols' murders were not immediately connected. Homicides were common every day, but as was common at the time, and not much different than it is today, the newspapers did decide to use the murder and its fairly gruesome nature to sell a few papers. And so Polly Nichols' face, an illustration of her, lying in her own coffin, as well as some of the officers on the scene, were splashed all over the police news. And at that time, much like, as I say, we are today when we watch shows like Cops or any of the many, many murder shows like CSI and Criminal Minds, people were fascinated by this kind of thing. And so in London town, downtown London, where the upper class lived, they were well aware that this was happening because they had just as much of a lascivious sort of appetite for stories of murder as anybody else. And so Polly Nichols' story certainly began to make the rounds. But something in the investigation of Polly Nichols' murder began to make waves almost from the start. And that was that the nature of the cuts were too precise to be random. And so it was considered that the murder weapon was possibly either a post-mortem scalpel or a Liston knife, which was a knife often used on the battlefield for amputation. And this is the sort of thing that not only wouldn't an average transient murderer have, but certainly wouldn't have known how to use with precision. And the precision and the depth and everything about these cuts began to cause people to whisper that the person who was doing these killings might have some medical knowledge. And that, as you can imagine, was really, really causing waves, because the assumption across the board was that the person committing these killings was just a transient, was a person who was a human degenerate, and that would never, of course, come from the upper class. And so they assumed that it had to be a lower class person because those are the only sorts of people who got up to that sort of thing.
And not only lower class, but now prejudice starts kicking in, racism starts kicking in. And as we can see with some of our suspects later, not all of it is really, NCIS kind of points of view. A lot of the stuff is tinged with extreme biases.
Very much so. And by the way, Mary Beth, it's a great question about how much blood was on the scene. And the answer is not nearly enough. One of the things that they specifically mention in many of the cases is that often the women were believed to not have been killed on the location because of the lack of arterial blood spray and the lack of blood on location. Now, that isn't the case in every one of them, but it is the case in several of the most high profile of the cases, and it does lead people to have some significant questions about the where the bodies, where the killings were done, and if the bodies were left in the same location. So that's something we're going to talk a little bit later about, and Ron gave us a few hints about that. But before we get much farther, we have to understand that only about a little over a week after the killing of Polly Nichols, another body turned up. And this time it was a much more extraordinary case. So this was Annie Chapman, long considered to be the second victim, on September 8th. So again, just a little bit over a week, again, of 1888. And when Annie Chapman was discovered, and she was discovered in Hanbury Street of Whitechapel. And that, by the way, is a real photograph of Annie Chapman and a real photograph of Hanbury Street dating from about the era of the Ripper killings. So you can see this was an area that was deeply impoverished, with store shops closed, filthy back alleys, and truly a nightmarish place. Annie's body was found in a fairly remarkable condition. She had also had her throat slit, but her innards had now been almost entirely removed. Her intestines had been pulled out of her insides and slung over her shoulder. Her liver and a couple of her other organs had been placed on her left shoulder, her intestines placed over her right, and several belongings from her pockets, coins, a comb, and a few things, were placed in a fairly precise way alongside the body. And there was a sense of almost ritualistic positioning to how she was left. Once again, there wasn't a tremendous amount of blood on the ground, certainly no arterial spray on the wall, and people began to wonder again if she had been killed in the location of where the body was found. But obviously the killer had some time in that location, not only to perform such an elaborate arrangement of her body, but to have been able to place the things around her. She wasn't simply dumped there. Obviously, the killer had some time. So there now appeared to be some extraordinary forethought. There was not merely motive here, but there was a sense of intent that began to be much different than your typical homicide, and it did begin again to cause waves, and people started to think there was nothing random about this anymore.
Right. The other thing too, that was a very poignant thing that you showed. Actually, a picture, an honest to goodness picture of the woman that was killed. A lot of these women who turned to a life of prostitution had no other choice. Some of these people were married and their husbands had left. Some of the people just had a falling out with society, and there was really nothing that a woman could do. They had no other. Commerce but their own bodies. So these women were selling themselves for about the cost of a loaf of bread. So what you see there is a young person that had the whole world at her feet, and then it deteriorated into her body is now strewn on a dead-end street in Whitechapel. So it really does say a lot about the women at the time as well too. And those people that are reading these articles in the West End, some of these people might even visit there every now and then when their wives aren't looking. And this is like if you were looking at almost a movie, because none of this made any kind of real sense to anybody, but it was a great cliffhanger, wasn't it? These women didn't mean anything to anybody, but gosh darn it, it has a good story attached to it.
And there's another thing, and I read this recently, and it was a fascinating observation, and one I'm going to admit that I had never considered before. And they said that we have become very accustomed. In fact, it's just considered par for the course that the women that the Ripper attacked and murdered were prostitutes, but that phrase really may miss the truth of the situation. In almost every case, they probably were prostituting themselves. They were probably engaged in the act of survival by selling their bodies. The only thing that they had left after they lose their jobs, they lose their homes, their husbands, what have you. And in some cases, maybe being even forced into that by a spouse or by a boyfriend or a pimp or something like that. But calling them a prostitute is such a finite idea. It in a way, it implies that there was nothing else to them. They were simply prostitutes. And in so many cases of the women in the East End, including most likely the Ripper's victims, prostitute was not what they were. It was something they did to survive. And we should understand that these were human beings. They had lives, they had dreams, and many of them probably hoped eventually that they could go, have a life beyond this, that they could buy their way out of this kind of poverty. Unfortunately, for these women, that never happened. But for some, I would hope that it did. But we should understand that they were very much human beings and not simply another number in the Ripper's sort of catalog of crimes.
Right, absolutely. But as somebody pointed out, sounds like America today. We view it the same exact way. Something happens that's desperate. You already ask, were they on drugs? You're always looking for a reason to make it go down a little bit easier.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is so easy to dehumanize people who are in unfortunate circumstances. And that's something that we, again, do every day here in this country. We frequently refer to people who are either jobless, homeless, or seeking asylum as inhumans and inhuman. And unfortunately, that's a terrible and by the way, I should say, an extremely unchristian perspective. And it often comes so much from people who lay claim to a degree of Christian morality, and something that is very antithetical to that.
Right.
Now,
about this time, that's a good point, because about this time, the Salvation Army is starting to do a great bit of canvassing in Whitechapel at this time as well, too. And Pepper Jackie said women had very little rights at this time. As a matter of fact, in London, there were more rights for animals than there were for women. The animal rights movement started up just a little bit before women's right movement did in England.
It's a twisted truth, and a fact, and it's a holdover from medieval morality in many ways. I mean, in medieval, Eddas and sagas, you frequently had situations where entire sagas described all the heroic and magnificent adventures of men and their swords, but and the swords almost always had names, but the women did not. And that perspective, unfortunately, carried forth in this sort of idea of this male nobility and the irrelevance of women, that women were nothing except the sort of chattel of men. And that's something that has in many ways continues to survive in a lot of ways to this day. And we may have made progress, but we have a very, very long way to go. And that actually factors into some of what would come later. In fact, about this time, the police began to receive letters purportedly from the killer. And this was where things took quite a significant turn. As I say, at this point, this kind of thing had never happened before. But on September 25th of 1888, I don't know if this first letter was received by the press or by the police, but letters started showing up to local newspapers, to the police, and even to a local task force that was kind of a neighborhood watch. But the very first letter was addressed, "Dear Boss," and the content is really quite disturbing. "Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about betrayal. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them until I do get buckled. Grand work last night was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and I want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue, so I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I shall do, I shall clip the ladies' ears off and send them to the police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get the chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. Ha ha. Now that is sick. That is truly, truly depraved. But the fascinating thing about this letter, a couple of very fascinating things about it. The first, maybe the most notable, is that this is the letter that gave us the name Jack the Ripper. This is apparently the killer identifying himself or giving himself a name, but that's if in fact it came from the killer, and we don't know this. And this is the sort of thing that has made the story such a mystery over the last 135 years. Is that quite a few letters were received, many of which had details that seemed to be knowledgeable about the crimes and details that weren't even released to the public. And yet many of them came in different handwriting, and there is almost no way to know for sure, especially without modern DNA evidence, if any of these came from the killer himself. But the one thing this letter made certain of is that no one would forget the name Jack the Ripper, and that now that would be the name that he would be known by, even if it didn't come from the killer, for the remainder of his legacy.
Yeah, there's some speculation that this was a newspaperman writing this, because now you have a name, you have a this monster out there at this point, but it does seem a little bit more intimate, doesn't it, Chris? It doesn't seem quite as removed as if somebody was writing a headline.
Agreed. And here's something about it I found fascinating too. I'm not a criminologist, and I do not claim to be, but I will say the things that I've observed about it, and I know other people have observed similar things, is that the language appears almost intentionally to want to sound uneducated. It wants to sound very street. It wants to sound very cocky. But if you've ever watched a show written by adults where they're writing dialogue for children or trying to write dialogue for people of a culture they're not familiar with, the dialogue always ends up sounding very awkward because they're not really familiar enough to convincingly write it. And this to me sounds, first of all, like somebody trying to sound uneducated who actually has some education. But even more so, if you look at the letters themselves, the handwriting is really very nice. It's really sharp and it's clean. And this is the hand of an educated person. May not be the upper crust, but it is definitely the hand of a person who went to school and was taught well to write. It's not the scrawl of of an uneducated person, many of whom at that time would have been illiterate to begin with. And so that right there is an interesting clue, either about the true identity or true sort of character of the Ripper, if in fact this was written by the killer, or possibly evidence that it wasn't actually written by the killer at all, but written by somebody attempting to drum up news, or for that matter, a copycat who just wanted the attention. Unfortunately, that's the kind of thing that we certainly see even today as well. So fascinating, though, that this sort of began. It gave birth in many ways to the character, the legend of Jack the Ripper, even more so than possibly the murders themselves.
Yes. And now we have a name to work on, and it makes great headlines.
It did indeed. Now, the person who ended up being assigned as the lead investigator to this case, and this right here is quite significant, was Inspector Frederick Aberline. He was the lead investigator in the Whitechapel murders, competent, and he was a very respected detective. He had a good career so far, but he was pitted against what appeared to be a very truly cunning killer, a killer who didn't leave a tremendous amount of clues behind. Not that at this point the art of detection was quite as good as it would get later on. We didn't yet have fingerprints or anything like that, but he also was hampered by the classism of Victorian England, and his failure ultimately to catch the Ripper. That's not a spoiler. We've already told you that the identity of the Ripper was never revealed. May have ended his career or came quite close to it. But the thing about this, and this is where it gets really interesting, is that the fact that they assigned Aberline to this case at all. Again, you have to understand that as we mentioned earlier, when a woman of ill repute, when a woman from the bad side of town was killed, it was often considered to be just the hazards of that kind of a dissolute life. And people didn't consider these people to be of value, and it was simply swept under the rug. So at this point, with what we could realistically call possibly the third killing, certainly the second, possibly the third killing, maybe people were beginning to have a little bit more concern because of the savagery of the killings. Maybe it was because the evidence started to look a little bit less like it was a common rabble doing it. But they assigned a very noteworthy detective, and that, of course, gained some attention. But the direct superior to Aberline was Sir Charles Warren. He was the commissioner of police, and it is an almost indisputable fact that Charles Warren was far more of an impediment to the investigation of the case than he was a help to it, because Warren wanted the case open and closed. He wanted to just find somebody that they could hang for the crimes. Didn't even matter to Warren if that person was the real killer or not. As far as Warren was concerned, prostitutes, or as he would have referred to them, I'm sure, whores or slatterns, were killed every day. He simply wanted them wanted the case shut. He had political pressure already beginning to build, but Warren would eventually retire in utter disgrace for his failure to oversee the eventual capture of the Ripper. And so these were the Aberline and Charles Warren would have been the two most notable public figures connected to the investigation of the Ripper case.
Yeah, very interesting. And there were people that were questioned, right? And this isn't like they didn't ever take anybody into custody. They took quite a few people into custody and questioned a lot of people, but never been able to actually pin it on anyone.
That's correct. And we're going to go over the specific suspects a little bit later. But there was one that I'll kind of give you the idea in advance, just because it's a fascinating one, is that there was a kind of a boogeyman at the time. And people were talking about a figure that they came to call Leather Apron. Mm-hmm. Leather Apron was probably, or quite possibly at least, not a real person, but Leather Apron was this figure, and I'm going to bring up this slide. We're jumping ahead a little bit on this one, but bring up the slide. So the Leather Apron was the fears of all of the people of Whitechapel brought to life. He was the fears of the people in uptown London brought to life. He was a commoner. He was this thuggish character who wore a leather apron to protect himself. Who used a leather cutting knife, and he has become the boogeyman version. But he was the one that the people were saying they would spot him anytime they spotted a stranger. They'd seen Leather Apron. He was given a name, or supposedly a name, that said that he was John or Jack Pizer, but the truth is that he may never have existed at all. He may have been, sort of a blown up version of a local thug or an enforcer that somebody suspected, but there was never any actual person that was really connected to this character of Leather Apron, and whether in fact he existed or not, we just don't know. But it does appear that this first very, very publicized character was nothing but a fictional sort of a boogeyman to give people, maybe for kids to, parents to tell their kids to go to bed early. I don't know, but so Leather Apron may never have existed, but he was actually kind of the first suspect, why we would call him, in the official Ripper killings.
Yeah. What's cool about this as well, too, when we look at the various other paranormal phenomenon, a lot of people report the Hat Man, which is still in vogue to this very day. And, Leather Apron and, wearing this kind of Victorian hat, it kind of starts connecting some dots that's kind of uneasy if you think about it.
It's a very iconic sort of a boogeyman figure. Yeah. I mean, with anything, whether there's a shadow people, the Slender Man, there's always this idea of this sort of shadowy, creature lurking in the background. And in fact, you're right, for probably centuries, we often see these as dressed in a very dapper way. It's a kind of it's the irony. I think it's the sort of delicious irony of a monstrous creature wearing a cultured face. But that is something that often is true in real life. And I think I mentioned this when we did our Sleepy Hollow episode back around Halloween time. Is one of the best lines from that is evil wears many guises, none more insidious than the mask of virtue. And I think that because that sort of dapper idea or that dapper appearance, and we definitely get that with the Jack the Ripper figure, the dapper appearance hiding a monster is something that is a little extra terrifying.
Agreed.
So once again, a few weeks after the Annie Chapman killing, we have what is often referred to as the double event. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes both murdered on September 30th, 1888. But this is where it starts to get fascinating, because we are virtually certain, I say we as if I was the investigator, but you know what I'm saying, it is virtually certain that what happened is that the Ripper was disturbed when he was attacking his first victim, Elizabeth Stride, because Elizabeth Stride's injuries were minimal. She was killed. I suppose I shouldn't underplay it, but they were not nearly as extensive. She had bruising on the shoulder and the collar blade, the shoulder blade and the collarbone, but her injuries, while fatal, were nowhere near as extensive as normally. So she was discovered because somebody spotted a sort of a cloaked figure hovering over somebody laying on the ground in an alley, called for help. I believe they were reputed to have called fire, which was a very wise thing. They say that no one will come if you call out murder, but if you call fire, the people will respond. But once again, as I say, the throat was cut, and so while she was never brutalized, Elizabeth Stride still died. So the police were summoned. They came and they began to investigate the site. But less than 45 minutes later, about a quarter of a mile away, another body was discovered. And this was the second victim that night. And this time, he had found time to complete what he called his work. So they say perhaps the Ripper felt untouchable. Maybe the madness just turned too hot to be denied, but he continued on and ended up truly brutalizing the body of Elizabeth Stride. Once again, the innards were removed, tremendous damage done to both her womb and her abdomen. Her innards again placed over the right shoulder, some of her innards tucked underneath the crook of her left arm. Her throat, once again, deeply, deeply slashed. But now we have some of the rage that we were talking about earlier. Despite the fact that in many cases these sort of wounds were very precise and there was a great deal of intent here, I believe that he must have been angry, maybe because he was denied his first victim, and so his rage must have built, and he truly destroyed Elizabeth Stride. He terrible wounds to the face, as you can see here in this, which is a replica of the original police sketch of this, or the coroner's sketch. You have tremendous damage done, and this was done with more savagery. There's clearly a sense of intent here, but the savagery is very, very high, and much more so than we had seen before. And so this double event was the sort of, moment when I believe people truly began to realize that this was no longer a series. There's no chance this was a series of random events. This was now a monster stalking the streets.
Now, do we know anything about what kind of organs were indeed removed and kept?
Was a great question. And Sarah, I see you're asking that as well. And maybe you've got a little bit of a precognitive ability here, because it wasn't long before now one of the local watch organizations, as I say, kind of a neighborhood watch, received a letter again from the Ripper, but this time it was different. This letter contained a human kidney, half of a human kidney specifically. And this was sent to a man named George Lusk, who was considered quite a local thug on his own. But like a lot of people who are self-appointed protectors, while he was a thug that had more than a few run-ins with the law of his own, he also ran this local watch claiming to protect the people of Whitechapel. And the content of this letter was much more brief, but still very, very disturbing. In fact, probably the most disturbing so far. The letter is simply introduced from hell. Mr. Lusk, and by the way, the misspellings here are accurate to the letter. Again, whether this is because the person writing it was truly uneducated or trying to appear that way, I can't say for sure. Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. To other piece, I fried and ate it. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife I took it out with if only you wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk. Now this, again, horrifically disturbing. The kidney that was sent was a human kidney. At least that's what the doctors, the police were able to determine. They brought it to the coroner. The coroner did conclude that it was a human kidney, and very well may have come from one of the victims. Quite likely, I would say, Elizabeth Stride, the second victim. So the answer is, by the way, Sarah, yes, the kidneys were removed in several cases. In one case, put up on the shoulder. In another case, it seems that at least a good significant portion of it was removed. And so what was interesting about this, or fascinating, and certainly, again, raising a lot of alarms, is that there was no question at this point that the killer had at least a degree of anatomical knowledge. And it may sound as if you could simply unzip a human body and remove the organs, but of course it's not like that at all. When you, if you were to cut open a human body, you are dealing with muscle and viscera and tremendous amounts of blood, and they're not neatly labeled, they're not color coded, they would need to be identified. And whatever or whoever was doing this was able to identify and remove with a degree of precision individual organs. And that was the thing that was really beginning to disturb people, is, again, the clear evidence that this person had at least a degree of medical knowledge. And so the idea that this was a random killer or just some psychopath was no longer feasible. It had to be somebody that was educated. And that terrified not just the common people who were afraid of being killed, but it terrified the aristocracy, and that fear went right to the highest levels of the English monarchy, and it began to involve Queen Victoria and the people associated with Queen Victoria, who got directly involved in starting to sort of pressure Charles Warren, Aberlin, and others to produce results and to end what was going on. So this was a case that was getting much more complicated as every week and every few days by.
Yeah,
Or a butcher hunter. Well, yeah, Dahlia, that's probably a possibility, but there is, again, remember that the human body is not the same as an animal body. And so even knowing how to properly dissect something like a cow or a pig or other things that a butcher or a hunter might know well to do wouldn't give you the degree of knowledge, at least not automatically, to be able to do this to a human being. I mean, obviously it would give you a leg up, but it certainly doesn't answer the question of understanding exactly where these things exist in the human body. So it's a great theory. It's just not one that's an absolute.
Yeah. Sarah Yosef writes, were the body locations close to any meat markets or morgues or hospitals? And that was what's so fascinating, because the Royal Hospital of London is right there in Whitechapel. Actually, I looked at a couple of the killing locations, and one of them you can actually see the hospital over the buildings. The hospital would probably have been, if you were running, about 5 to 7 minutes away from the majority of the killings. So if this were indeed a doctor, and I see where you're going with this, one of the easiest things to do would be to simply hide in the hospital, right? To disappear into the place where you work, you would be unseen. And that's one of the things that, as a researcher and somebody that takes a little bit of, side fun and try to figure out what's going on here. That is one of my theories that we're going to go with a little bit later.
And of course, you mentioned something earlier, and it's one that has been a theory that a lot of people have suggested. There's a great deal of good reason for it. Thinking this is that the killer managed not only to disappear without a trace after these killings, and with the exception of the one case where he was caught, attempting to attack the first woman and ended up going on and killing Elizabeth Stride, but he would sort of vanish, and he wasn't. No one was seen with blood on them or anything like that. But the people who had spotted figures that they believed may have been the Ripper, whether it was a person out of place or this figure bending over the body of was it Catherine Eddowes? I apologize. It's easy to confuse the names of these victims, but was very well dressed, reported to be a man of fairly stout build, so not extremely thin or anything like that. Maybe a little bit on the tall side, with a mustache, but well dressed. And this is something that again began to send shockwaves, because people were beginning to strongly suspect that this was what they would often call a toff, which was a person of means, a gentleman who was prowling. Now, it wasn't completely unusual to see gentlemen in Whitechapel, because one of the ways that a lot of people in Whitechapel did survive was by prostitution. And so men from the good side of town, as Ron had mentioned earlier, absolutely came to Whitechapel to sort of get a little bit of exercise on if their wives were away, or if they had nothing to hold them down. So it wasn't completely unusual, but to see one of these people sort of bent over a body in an alley was certainly not a common sight. And so it began to make the rounds that this figure, this Ripper figure, was absolutely a person of means and possibly a gentleman. So never seen walking the streets later with blood on him, which is why people have suggested that he had a coach nearby, which is something that a common person, the general residents of Whitechapel wouldn't have access to. But if he was a man of means, a nobleman, a businessman, that he may in fact have had a coach waiting nearby that nobody would have given a second look to.
And with that theory is also the idea that he wasn't acting alone. There's also an accomplice involved as well, too.
Correct. Absolutely. We're gonna. I didn't actually make a slide for him, but we have a name even for one of the potential accomplices that may have been responsible for this, and so we'll discuss him a few minutes later when we get into the subject of the suspects. But all this was going to come to a truly horrifying head in November. So it was it's a good chunk of time since the last one. It was mid-September for the last one, or it was the end of September for the last killing. It wasn't until November 9th that what appears to be canonically final victim of Jack the Ripper, and that was Mary Jane Kelly. She was from Ireland, and she was from Kilkenny, Ireland. Mary Jane Kelly killed on November the 9th, 1888 in Miller's Court. But this was a very, very different situation, because Mary Jane Kelly was not discovered in the street. Mary Jane Kelly had a small room off of Miller's Court, and the killer, the Ripper, probably managed to engage her services and went into her room with her. And there behind a closed door with no one to observe, the Ripper took his time. And this is where something, again, I warn you that these images, especially 2 images over, is going to be a little bit on the distressing side. But the Ripper truly savaged this poor woman. Spent hours in this room, at least 2 hours, they say, for him to do the damage that he did. Removed her breasts and put them on the nightstand next to her, removed her nose and her ears, her innards once again taken out and splayed up. Seems like they may have intended to put them over the shoulder, whether they stayed there or not. Took enormous chunks of flesh from her legs, literally eviscerated this woman. And I warn you again, this is a photo, not a clear one, but a photo of the actual crime scene, and truly one of the most horrible photos I've ever seen. You can see here, even in this low quality photo, just how savagely he butchered this poor young woman. Again, with no time, with plenty of time at his disposal and no one to disturb him, he was able to truly take out his savagery. And this was the one that absolutely shocked London and shocked the world. By this time, the name of Jack the Ripper was widespread and very, very well known. But this was, as far as we understand, the last of the Whitechapel killings, and it was the one that he had saved all of his savagery for. So truly a terrible event.
Yeah, that is very difficult to look at. Somebody asked earlier if there was ever any defense wounds that were discovered. I don't ever remember anything written about looking at the hands or the fingers or anything like that, if there was any cuts. But that one photo that you showed, it does look like there are a few marks on the arm. I don't know if those could be defense wounds or not.
The one thing that is probably true is that it's rare. It's unlikely these women had a chance to defend themselves, because the MO of the Ripper appears to be that he would slit the throat first, the very first thing that he would do. And in fact, depending on if he whether he ever actually had sexual congress with these women, and killed them afterwards, or initiated it in order to put himself in the correct position, but it's believed that he would have come up from behind them, slit the throat, which would have killed them very, very quickly, as well as preventing them from screaming. So it's quite possible that these women never had a chance to defend themselves in any noble way. Because remember, if in fact, and it's almost certain, these women were engaging in an act of prostitution with the killer, unbeknownst to him, they were letting him get close and they were letting him get intimate with them. And so they were letting down their guard, and something they were accustomed to doing. So unfortunately, whereas another person who might actually be anticipating an attack from a stranger approaching them, these women, I believe, were largely taken by surprise.
And I don't want you to go back to the picture again, but these were very, very frail looking women, weren't they? I mean, if you look at that one girl's arms and legs, these were just skinny little girls. It's so somebody that was stout, any man, let's put it that way, would easily be able to take advantage of these girls.
Yeah, it's likely that they were almost all consistently malnourished. They weren't they weren't getting sunlight. They weren't getting a decent regimen of vitamins. Many of them, of course, were probably drinking heavily before the killings took place. It was one of the only ways that people had to cope with day to day, the horrors of their day to day lives. Never mind this kind of thing. And so, as I say, not impossible, but unlikely these women ever had a chance to defend themselves. I mean, honestly, if there is any consolation in any of this, it's the idea that in most cases, hopefully, they were dead before some of the more grievous of these wounds were inflicted, and so spared at least that small portion of the horror.
And if I'm not mistaken, the little room that was rented did show evidence of arterial spray, did it not?
Yes. Again, it's presumed that he entered the room under the pretense of being a client, and then did all of his work there without the necessity to, take her into a coach or another enclosed area, as the other murders at least seem to imply, considering the minimal blood in the location.
Right. And we have to think about this, because the human body has around 4 gallons of blood in it. He would have been necessarily drenched in this stuff. I mean, it probably, after he was done, it would have been dripping from his body.
Yes, and I suppose in that situation he had the means to disrobe, to change. Whether he carried a bag that had a change of clothing or anything, we can't say for sure. If he had a coach or some other easy escape route nearby that was pre-planned, these are methodical killings. There was there was nothing random about them. And so it does appear, especially since he was so successful at both approaching and claiming victims, but also escaping detection, as he did right up until this last killing, that he seems to have had a plan. And so, we don't know for sure exactly how things unfolded that night, but the victim was never, or the killer was never actually seen with the victim, only discovered when I believe that, she didn't pay the rent or didn't show up for a shift. A lot of these women, in addition to selling their bodies when they had small jobs at local workhouses as laundry women and things like that. And so not showing up, somebody would eventually come and knocked on the door and eventually either peered through the window or opened the door and found her body that way. So we don't even know for certain that she was killed on November 9th, but November 9th was when the body was discovered. Now, as I mentioned, no one has ever positively identified the Ripper, but there are some theories ranging from very mundane, that it was a local, it was just a disgruntled local, one of the, pimps or, brothel managers taking out revenge on the girls for misbehaving. Obviously, there's very little evidence to suggest that, and the brutality of the crimes doesn't suggest that kind of thing, but that's a common suggestion. Others just that it was a drifter who was, sort of taking out his rage. But some are far more elaborate than that. And there are some intriguing clues. We already mentioned that the positioning of the bodies and the way that the innards and the killings were formed, even the artifacts from the pockets of the women placed around the body in these ways that seemed almost ritualistic, certainly caused some intrigue. But one of the most unique ones is, I believe it was after the Annie Chapman killing, was a message that was found scrawled on the wall near what is believed to have been a bloody scarf that they believe was either the victim's scarf or possibly the killer's scarf, discarded because it was soaked with blood. Now, if this message had anything to do with killings, we can't be sure. It may have been random. Graffiti was certainly not uncommon, but this message was quite unusual and certainly gave birth to a lot of truly crazy notions. So the message, the Jewes are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. It's a fascinating thing. It doesn't appear to mean anything, although, of course, the very first thing that a lot of the people, the police on the site, saw and assumed that this was the word Jews, that the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. But the statement itself is awkward. It's stated in a very awkward way. By the way, the text of it has been interpreted, and we don't know because they wiped it off the wall as soon as it was discovered, has been interpreted as both the Jewes are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, and it has also been recorded as the Jewes are not the men who will be blamed for nothing. So even the meaning of it is uncertain. Whether this was some only semi-literate person trying to pin something on the Jews for the killings, or whether it had no connection to it, if the word Jewes, Jewes, refers to Jews or refers to something else, we don't know. But it does lead into, I think, one of the most unique and fascinating theories connected with this, because nearly every person
I
of
think we may have had a
consequence.
moment of being frozen here, there, Christopher.
Oh, did we?
But
Sorry about that.
until he comes back on, Christopher, you there?
I'm here.
All right. Well, until he comes back. Okay, great. Okay, great. And on my side, I don't know if anybody else saw, but the whole thing just kind of froze up for a second.
I do apologize about that. I had to clear through the whole thing, but so again, all I was saying is that this message scrawled on the wall. I don't know if I froze for everybody else, but who got the most of this, but this message scrawled on the wall, the Jewes are the men that will not be blamed for nothing, may have been somebody's illiterate attempt to write the word Jews. It may had nothing to do with Jews. It may have been anti-Semitic. It may not have, but we don't know what it means. It could even potentially have been scrawled by the killer. But what's interesting about it is that it does lead into one of the more unique theories, because almost every man of consequence in England at that time, the royal, members of the royal family, members of the police, upper class businessmen, would have been Freemasons. And Freemasons, of course, are a fraternal organization that dates back at least to the 12th or 13th century. It's been connected to the Knights Templar and many other things. It still exists to this day. You've probably got a Freemason temple in your own town. But the Freemasons are sort of a Christian organization, but they have fairly elaborate rituals. They have a very close-knit sort of brotherhood. They have secret rituals, and there is a sort of Freemasons or death perspective, at least that has been a part of them for many, many years. Now, nowadays, the Masons aren't really much different than your local Rotary Society, but at the time, they would have been considered to be quite elite, and the connection to the Freemasons is interesting because there is one legend, or not a legend, but a story from biblical legend of what are called the three Jewes: Jubilah, Jubilo, and Jubilum. Now, these were three men who murdered the architect of Solomon's temple. So this is a legend that is very, very common among the Freemasons because the Japhet, I believe, was the name of the architect of Solomon's temple, was the Mason. He was the Mason who the Freemasons are referring to as the origin of their organization. And when these three assassins were caught, Jubilah said, "Oh, that my throat had been cut across, my tongue torn out, and my body buried in the rough sands of the sea." Jubilo said, "Oh, that my left breast had been torn open, and my heart and vitals taken from thence and thrown over my left shoulder." And Jubilum said, "Oh, that my body had been severed in two in the midst and divided to the north and the south, my bowels burnt to ashes." Now, this is a theory. It's a conspiracy theory, and there's no certainty whatsoever that the person who wrote this was referring to Jubilah, Jubilo, and Jubilum, who could be referred to as the Jewes. There's certainly no certainty that this was a Masonic message, but it certainly got people's tongues wagging. The police, many of their people, including Sir Charles Warren, were members of the Freemasons, and this may have been recognized as a message that somehow the Ripper had a connection to Freemasonry. And this is going to factor in a moment or two when we start to talk about a couple of the other subjects. But this is a piece of evidence that's long been debated about its connection, especially being found right there, written in chalk on a wall beneath a very short distance from where the body was found, and with a bloody scarf belonging either to the victim or to the Ripper himself.
You know what? I never heard that story
before. I gotta make sure I'm not
frozen completely on
it. So I want to talk about some of the suspects specifically. Now, we're not going to cover every suspect. There are many suspects, people who have been put forth, whose names have been put forth for the identity of the Ripper. And some of them, there's very little to it. Some of them, there's some quite intriguing ideas. The first of those, of course, we already discussed, was the character, this fictional or possibly fictional character of Leather Apron. We don't know for certain that he was fictional. It's possible that there was a real person behind this. And I suppose it's not impossible that this mysterious figure with the leather apron and the leather cutting knife could have been the killer. But because no actual human being has ever been sort of identified as the character of Leather Apron, it's still reasonable to say, I believe, that this is a character from fiction. By the way, just a note, folks, as I say, I did assume that we were going to run over a little bit, and we have. We're probably going to go to roughly 10:30 on this. I hope you'll stick with us on this one. The second is one, Ron, you were saying earlier that there was an element of anti-Semitism and of bigotry that certainly came to the forefront in a lot of the suspicion here. People often immediately pointed the finger at immigrants, and Aaron Kosminski was a Polish immigrant of Jewish descent living in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. So with high anti-Semitic sentiment, Kosminski's status certainly made him an easy scapegoat. And it is suggested that he was later placed in an insane asylum after supposedly threatening his wife with a knife and threatening to cut her throat. But this is probably, or at least possibly, a later elaboration or sort of embellishment to the story. And in fact, that the person placed in the insane asylum that they associated him with was a completely different person named Nathan Kaminsky. So again, not a particularly high likelihood that this was the subject, but it was easy back then to pick out an immigrant and point the finger, which is, I say, unfortunately, something we still do a little bit too often today.
Oh, right. It has to be the foreigner. It has to be the other, because we ourselves could not do such a thing.
And othering takes place in quite a few of these victims, in fact. Another very popular figure who doesn't have a great deal of evidence leveled against him, but has often been a very popular subject for the Ripper killer, would be Montague John Druitt. So Montague John Druitt was the son of a respected surgeon. So he would have at least maybe had access to medical instruments and maybe a little bit of medical knowledge, although to the best of anyone's knowledge, not a doctor or trained in any way himself. But he committed suicide in early December of 1888. And his resemblance was similar to what people had described. He was from an upper class family, not rich, but certainly well enough off. He had the mustache, the clean cut look. He would have dressed in a dapper way. He wasn't a particularly large man, so I don't know if anybody would have described him as stout, but he bears enough resemblance to descriptions of the Ripper that he made an easy target, especially because of his suicide. His suicide made him an easy target that couldn't defend himself, but also because there was a reputation associated with him, or at least rumors associated that he was a homosexual. And once again, at that time, the time when homosexual activity was considered illegal and you could be arrested for it, rumors of homosexual activity automatically associated people with deviancy. And if you were a deviant, there's no reason that you couldn't be a murderous deviant. And so Druitt, again, a very popular target for the Ripper conspiracy, as it were.
And because he committed suicide, the idea of closing the case very quickly is really something that the police would like to jump at.
Exactly. You've got an easy. You don't have to worry about a trial or anything. You've got your killer basically, locked, shocked, and buried, and you can wipe your hands of it, which was something that was a very attractive notion.
Right. And not only did you have your killer, you also got rid of a homosexual within your community as well.
Exactly. Yeah, an easy write-off, and then you just cross your fingers and hope that the killings stop,
Right.
or that you can continue to deny them and write them off if, in fact, the killings did continue.
Right.
Call it a copycat. But again, he was an easy scapegoat, and so not one that I've ever put a great deal of stock in. So next on the list is one who does get a lot of traction. This is someone who has been put forth in the real top list of Ripper suspects, and that would be Walter Sickert. Walter Sickert was a painter, and he was considered quite eccentric, but he was also said to be on the misogynistic side. In fact, there were images in some of his paintings. His paintings had a dark and disturbing nature to them, and many people said that the paintings bore eerie similarity to scenes from the Ripper killings. Now, I think it's fair to say that that there might be some stretch in that, but even notable crime writers like Patricia Cornwell firmly support it. In fact, Patricia Cornwell wrote a complete book claiming to solve the case of Jack the Ripper, and is very firmly convinced that that Walter Sickert was the Ripper. Now, here's an interesting comparison because I feel I owe it to you. Although I think that this is very coincidental, it is worth noting that again, I apologize, maybe I should have warned you that again we have a picture of the savaged corpse of Mary Kelly and Walter Sickert's paintings with an image of a man who may well in fact be Sickert himself, sitting on a bed next to a nude woman who appears to be asleep, unconscious, or something else. But the positioning of the body, you could certainly draw a comparison between the two, but I think that it is a very easy comparison to make about anything. And so I don't think that it's convincing, but you can understand how a person seeing both the photograph and seeing these paintings of Sickert, some of which, as I say, had a sort of misogynistic bent to them, might have held on to this conclusion. And so I think that he is what I'd call a fair target for suspicion, although certainly again not a tremendously convincing one. People have suggested that he wrote diaries, but those diaries are really inconclusive. Again, not anti-Semitic, but rather misogynistic content. There were a lot of people back then who were misogynist, and that's certainly not a crime in and of itself. So.
Right. These are people of their time, right? I mean,
very much so.
That's the thing. Also, harkening back to that picture, that there's this whole theory about poor Bob Ross, the painter on PBS as well, too, that he paints the pictures of where he has hidden his bodies, right? That's
behind the happy little tree.
That's right. Exactly.
Well-fed happy little tree, I guess. Now, this one is interesting because I had not had much familiar with him. The name had passed, my eyes once or twice, but I'd never really been familiar with him. And you were the one who drew my attention to this one. But he's a fascinating character, of course, and that would be Francis Tumblety. There's a name for you. Sounds like he should own a toy company. Irish American doctor of herbal medicine, frequently arrested for petty larceny, suspected indecent behavior with other men. So another person suspected of homosexual behavior. He was also in many ways considered to be a quack. Many people had no respect for his medical ideas. He claimed to be administering. He was American, Irish born, but mostly grew up in America. Did travel the world quite a bit. Herbal medicine, by that he claimed that he was giving Native American medicine to people, knew the secrets of life and death, etc. And certainly a curious character, but you know a fair amount more about him than I do.
Right. Well, one of our listeners, and I forget which one it was, said, I bet an American did this. See, this seems so outlandish that I agree with the audience here. I think Americans had to do this. So that's my thing. So we know Francis Tumblety came to America, to Rochester, New York, about the age of 5 years old. So he's brought up in America. We know that whenever he was a young boy, perhaps even before his teenage years, he was selling pornographic magazines, which were probably hand-drawn and stuff like that, along the Erie Canal. We know that he did indeed have petty larceny arrests. And then he kind of remade himself, and he comes out onto the scene as a doctor selling these kind of snake oil things. He became so popular that he actually had dinner with President Abraham Lincoln. So if he was a quack, he was very he had a charisma to him that would allow him to get into places other people could not get into, and people believed who he was. He would also dress as a military officer, although he had no military training. But what had happened was a few people started to die from his quack medicines, and then the next time we find him, he is in England, okay? And I think he met with heads of state over there. He became friends with Charles Dickens, so he was able to infiltrate a lot of the nobility over there.
Sounds like a modern George Santos.
Exactly, absolutely. except he did not dress up as a woman in Brazil.
We don't know that yet.
That's right. We don't. We're still doing some background information. But he was actually questioned for the Ripper murders. He was let go. But what's so curious is that whenever he leaves England, the killing stops. So does the killing stop because he leaves England or whatever? But the next time we find any trace of him, he's in New York City, and it's interesting because a few bodies show up floating in the Hudson River. But again, it's New York City, and that's not outside the realm of possibility. But because I live in Western Pennsylvania, I was able to trace him down to where he was a doctor at a brothel in Pittsburgh, where he was helping gentlemen with various types of venereal diseases. Okay, so we know that he was working within brothels, and we also, as you suggested there as well too, whenever he was living in Washington D.C. and claiming himself to be a doctor, he had jars of preserved uteruses at his disposal, and oftentimes after dinner, while you were smoking your cigar, he would bring them out and show the people that he had gathered there. And he believed that you could actually look at the uterus and tell what class of woman that it was from. So that's the thing. First of all, Americans are crazy. We know that. We know that he had this idea of, selling pornography whenever he was younger. We know that he was in these particular places. We know that the law enforcement did indeed question him. And we know that whenever he left England, the killings stopped. And whenever he came to America, some killings, even though they're tenuous at best, begin again.
He is a fascinating character, and again, I mean, even the things I read about him, that in addition to having been arrested at least as a primary suspect or as an initial suspect in the Ripper killings, was also arrested and taken in as a potential accomplice to the Lincoln assassination.
Yes,
that's quite a resume.
That's quite a resume. Yeah. He was actually questioned. Yeah, he was actually questioned for the Lincoln assassination. That's right.
Now, I will say that there was one notable point of doubt that I encountered when I was reading about him, which is that he was arrested for indecent behavior. Again, I believe supposed homosexual activity on the 7th of November of 1888, which was only 2 days before Mary Kelly was discovered. And so it does I find it a little bit at least difficult to reason that he was already out of prison and already on the hunt that quickly, but certainly that doesn't disprove or discount it, but it did strike me that was an awfully quick turnaround. You'd think that he would have laid low for a little while, but certainly a very, very fascinating character.
Absolutely.
And one that bears a great deal of I'd say at least further investigation. So now I would ask, is he your top suspect, would you think?
Oh no, this is far too confusing of a world that we dip our toes into. I don't think that I have a top suspect, to tell you the truth. I think all of them have some sort of merit to where we're going here. But actually, in my point of view, I don't think that this was a lone gunman. I think this was somebody that was working in tandem with at least one other person.
Well, we're actually just about to discuss a very interesting, and incredibly complicated case. And I'll say the same thing that you do. I don't know if I could honestly say that this is my top theory or either my two top theories, but I would say at least the most fascinating and the one that has held my attention for the longest. And it's the one that is kind of my favorite, even if I don't necessarily believe that it is the most compelling or the most convincing. But we have to start with the grandson of Queen Victoria herself. This was Prince Albert Victor, Prince Eddie, as he was known, because like a lot of men of means, he had about 17 names. It was Prince Albert Victor Edward, Duke of Clarence and Avondale. He was second in line to the throne, and I do believe that he was at least involved in some capacity with the affair that would become the Ripper murders, but Prince Eddie was rumored to have contracted syphilis, possibly in India during his time in the British Army, or also possibly from a brothel in Whitechapel. And one of the things that syphilis can absolutely contribute to is mental decline. It can leave a person mentally unstable and on the brink of insanity, as well as being physically debilitating. But in addition to the fact that he does bear a great deal of resemblance to the description of the Ripper, would have had access to a coach, would have had wide access to Whitechapel, was actually arrested or is rumored to have been arrested once in connection with a male brothel, not a female brothel, but a male brothel in Whitechapel. So there was a lot of scandal surrounding Prince Eddie, but he also had medical training while in the British Army. So you have quite an interesting package here. You have a person with extraordinary political impunity, with potentially reason to have misogyny towards women, whether that's connected with his homosexuality or potential homosexuality or the contraction of syphilis, any of those, with medical training, physically quite reminiscent of the appearance of the Ripper, at least according to some eyewitness accounts, and certainly with access to the means to disappear without a trace. So there's a lot of fascinating reason to believe that possibly Eddie could have been the Ripper.
Right. I agree with you. I like this guy. This is who my mother thought was the Ripper as well, too. And guess what? He would also have had a means to a coach and a coachman as well.
Very much so. But it doesn't end there.
It doesn't. The plot thickens, as they say.
Because even if Eddie wasn't the Ripper, I believe he was embroiled in some form of scandal in Whitechapel. We've already talked about his time at brothels there, and there is a second theory, and one that is equally fascinating, that that young Eddie, not a homosexual, or at least not homosexual, possibly bisexual, but that he ended up falling in love with a Catholic girl. Now, of course, the English monarchy is Protestant, and there was a tremendous, tremendous scandal connected to not only a commoner, but a Catholic commoner, and it is believed that possibly Eddie may have been married in secret to a shopkeeper, a young shop girl who was a Catholic, and that once the royal family got wind of this, that they had to hush it up immediately. Unfortunately, according to this theory, and this is about as crazy as a conspiracy theory as you'll get, unfortunately, that woman was with child. And so the theory, and this is one that's actually been the basis of a couple of the film versions of the Jack the Ripper story, but it is based on a pretty intricately investigated story. apparently this young woman was friendly with several of the other women in the area who in fact may have been women who sold their bodies when necessary on the street, including possibly Mary Kelly, Annie Chapman, and this little clutch of women, and that they were the ones who knew about her lover Eddie and the child, and that they unfortunately therefore posed a threat to the crown. Now, the story goes that the physician extraordinaire to Queen Victoria, Sir William Gull, was also, and we know that this is true, was the physician to Queen Victoria and the physician to the royal family, including Prince Eddie, and would have known, first of all, would have known very well if he was suffering from syphilis, but also was probably aware of his nighttime activities, whether in fact those activities were murderous or simply lascivious, but that the Queen instructed him to take care of it, and that the more extreme version of this theory is that Eddie wasn't the killer at all. That Eddie simply was getting up to some rowdy behavior in Whitechapel, and that what Queen Victoria was unaware of is that it was Sir William Gull who had syphilis and was already deeply in the throes of it, and his mind was no longer particularly sane.
Wow.
So this theory, as crazy as it gets, suggests that it was William Gull who, believing that he was doing the best thing for the crown, was able to hush up the story by murdering these prostitutes or arranging their deaths, and that the character of Jack the Ripper, including the letters, the attempt to make them look as if they were from an uneducated person, and everything was part of an elaborate cover-up that ranged with both William Gull, who would have had access to a coach and a coachman, a man by the name, by the way, of John Netley, who was an aspiring doctor and may have even, in fact, assisted in the murders themselves, but that they would travel by coach into the Whitechapel region, lure these women into the coach with promise of food. There's actually an interesting theory that they used exotic grapes because grapes would have been extremely expensive at that time, and that stalks of these grapes were found in a couple of places on the ground near the killings. Whether this is actually true or not, it's a fascinating theory. Lured them into the coach, killed them in the coach, and then after the work was complete, would drop them off in certain areas, arrange the bodies because, of course, Gull, as so many others, was a Mason, and leave them there. So again, it's an incredibly convoluted theory, but it's fascinating. And part of what makes this story fascinating, part of what makes the Ripper killings so fascinating, is the extraordinary theories behind it, some of which are wildly elaborate and again have been the subject of films, books, and speculation now for well over a century.
Right. Yeah, this is one of those rare times. Well, we're always talking about these monsters within our show that whenever we finally catch up to them and we corner them, we take off the mask. And of course, it's us underneath it. And Jack the Ripper is one of those first cases in history where a man himself is the monster in full display. And to think that this might be the royalty behind this. And I do have to give you a nod towards that as well, too, because even though it's kind of conspiracy-like, it makes a whole bunch of sense as well, too, sadly to say. But this person could easily disappear into the hospital if he wanted to, and nobody would bat an eye because, he's a doctor. Also, the idea of the stratification within society, too, that the monarchy can kind of see all their citizenry around them and kind of use them at will, if you will. You know what I mean? Kind of just, use them as cattle or surplus, what have you. Also, the idea that the prince had gotten an Irish girl pregnant, then we see that one of the killings was definitely an Irish Catholic girl as well, too. It starts making sense.
Yeah, there's a great deal that does. I mean, it's a well thought out theory, and of course, because I sort of blathered it out over the course of about a minute or two, I'm not giving you a comprehensive idea. In fact, if you are interested in learning more about the theory, it has been committed to film a couple of different times. I would say probably the most comprehensive version of it is the film From Hell, and it's not exactly a pleasant film to watch. It stars Johnny Depp and Heather Heather Graham, that's it. Ian Holm has a phenomenal cast, a beautifully made film, and it details that version, the Gull version of the story very well. And back in 1988, a century after the original Ripper killings, a TV movie was made starring Michael Caine, Jane Seymour, and that's quite an extensive cast, simply called Jack the Ripper. And this one also details this complicated plot. Both of these are worth watching. The one with Michael Caine is a little bit more sort of down to earth, maybe a little bit more straightforward. These are both great ways, if you're fascinated by this remarkably involved plot that may in fact have reached the royal family, to cover up the Jack the Ripper, or cover up Eddie's depredations, and created Jack the Ripper. However, in addition to From Hell, which is a great film, if you're interested in the theory of Dr. Gull being the Ripper, there's also a great little movie that portrays the prince as the Ripper, and that is simply called The Ripper. It was a 1997 television film. It had a small cast of notables, people you might know, like Patrick Bergen, who are fairly small-time actors, but it's not terribly difficult to find. Simply called The Ripper from 1997, and it does a very, very good job of portraying the story of the prince as the Ripper. And as with From Hell and some of the other movies that detail this royal conspiracy, it also shows you exactly why the Ripper was never caught, because once once it got to a breaking point, once either the last of the witnesses were silenced or what have you, the royal family was quite capable of simply making this entire thing go away. We do know that Prince Eddie largely disappeared from public view shortly after the end of the Ripper killings, and that he died a few years later, allegedly of pneumonia. There's extensive documentation by doctors, all of whom, of course, are in the royal employ, stating that he died of pneumonia, but that's an easy enough thing to cover up as well. So hard to say for sure, and it is the most crazy theory out there, but I think it's the one that at the very least is the most fascinating, even if it is the most far-fetched.
I agree. You know, I enjoyed this time with you today, Chris. I'm sorry that I missed you last week, but this was a great time to go in search of Jack the Ripper.
It really was. And just again, for those of you out there who find the story fascinating, and we said, there's nothing wrong with the fact that there is a great deal of romance to it. So this Ripper story has been portrayed in a lot of different films, some of which are great fun to watch. Hard to say murder is fun, but you know where I'm going with that. So for those of you in the market for some good Ripper action, other movies that are worth considering would be an excellent Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper movie. Unfortunately, Arthur Conan Doyle was never able to write a Sherlock Holmes versus Jack the Ripper story, but a great film version with Christopher Plummer and James Mason called Murder by Decree. This is another one that approaches the royal conspiracy theory and is beautifully done and certainly worth watching. If you want something a little bit more goofy, a little more lighthearted, is the I think it's 1966 or 1967 movie A Study in Terror, the first film version that pits Sherlock Holmes against Jack the Ripper. Now, that one's not terribly accurate. Its portrayal of the murders really doesn't bear a great deal of resemblance to the actual killings, but it's like an old Hammer horror film and still a great deal of fun to watch in all of its Technicolor grisly glory. If you're a fan, however, more of the science fiction or paranormal angle, you've got some nice options as well, because of course the Ripper always has some paranormal enthusiasts out there. One of them was a truly goofy TV movie made, I think, in 1985 or 1986, called Terror at London Bridge, although I think it was aired here in the US as Bridge Across Time. And this stars, of all people, David Hasselhoff.
It does. It stars the Hoff.
David Hasselhoff as a cop hunting down Jack the Ripper, who's traveled in time to the 20th century to, interestingly enough, and this is based in a weird way on a true story. It was at least inspired by a true fact, is that in Lake Havasu, Arizona, they actually have a replica of London Bridge. And the capstone of the bridge was actually taken from the original London Bridge and very ceremoniously installed there in Lake Havasu. And apparently this inspired somebody, the idea of that what if Jack the Ripper somehow was transported to modern day Lake Havasu and picked up his old tricks again. So certainly a fascinating, weird, and very goofy film. But if you like TV films, TV monster movies or sci-fi movies from the 1980s, I would say that Terror at London Bridge is a great deal of fun. You can find it right here on YouTube, actually.
It's so bad it's actually enjoyable. Truly, I mean, that's the thing.
It's terrible in the best of ways.
Exactly,
Uh,
exactly.
a little bit more legit, though, a great movie, a great fun movie for our last couple minutes here would be Time After Time. Time After Time stars the amazing Malcolm McDowell and the wonderful but late Jack Warner, who passed away very recently, as Jack the Ripper, and or rather as H.G. Wells and Jack the Ripper, respectively. Malcolm McDowell plays a young H.G. Wells who has invented a real time machine. And at a dinner party, one of his good friends, Dr. John Stevens, shows up in quite a hurry. And then when the police show up behind him, disappears into the basement, steals H.G. Wells' time machine, and travels to the future, where, as I believe that John had mentioned earlier, where he finds himself quite at home in the savagery of the 20th century. And it's a great movie. So I believe, Nicholas Meyer, maybe. People behind like the old Star Trek movies and the Superman movies, several of the creators behind those created this, and it is a fantastic film.
Right. It's extremely literate. There's no tongue in cheek in this. This is real actors doing real work.
Yeah, and it's a it's suspenseful. It's a great sort of a murder thriller with a little bit of that sci-fi angle and some good Ripper Ripper action in it, and one that I've loved ever since I was a kid. And interestingly enough, 4 or 5 years ago, ABC decided to readapt Time After Time into a series. And so Time After Time, it didn't air for very long. I think about 9 or 10 episodes aired, but Time After Time on ABC was 2017, so about 5 years ago, starring, again, a nice young cast as H.G. Wells and Jack the Ripper, again, transported into the future. But it actually went and combined elements of the Time Machine, the Island of Dr. Moreau, and a couple of H.G. Wells' other stories to spin its saga out into about 10 one-hour episodes. And although it's a shame that it didn't last, it actually did a pretty respectable job of creating a modern sort of a sci-fi adventure thing. And interestingly enough, we're talking about romanticizing the Ripper. They cast a very attractive young actor and make the Ripper into this very attractive character because they eventually attempt to redeem him, which is a fascinating idea. One I'm not completely sure I agree with, but it was an interesting approach and certainly worth checking out. So, all right. Well, folks, we have come to the 10:30 hour, and I don't want to keep you guys on the hook any longer than that. I'm really glad if you stuck with us for our whole show tonight. It was great fun, and certainly, I hope, worth the wait. Ron, thank you as ever for being a great sounding board to bounce a lot of this stuff off. And we're working on ideas for next week's exciting show, and very, very much hope that you will join us for that. But as always, please like and subscribe. If you have not subscribed to the channel, please do that. Hit the like button. Comment if you guys have any other questions or thoughts or anything that we didn't get to tonight. We always love to hear from you. And you can even be a super chatter and donate to the cause if you feel so inclined, although of course you're never required to do that. And as always, guys, we are so glad to have you here. So we look forward to seeing you in 1 week on another episode of Monday Night Mysteries, Myths, and Monsters. Good night, everybody. Good night, Ron.
Bye-bye.